In this video I'll be showing a selection of images taken at a private hide that I've been fortunate enough to use over several years. The pictures will be a mixture of foxes and birds, and I'll show the hides at the location as well as some of the setups that I've used to attract a wide range of birds to a feeding station. One of the hardest parts of setting up a feeding station is to find some private land to site it. It must be sited where there is a good range of birds and wildlife, and where the hide will not be vandalised. You obviously cannot set something up like this on public land, so ideally you need to find somewhere private where hopefully the owner will allow you to use their land. For me, this opportunity came about by pure chance. I gave a talk at a camera club, and at the coffee break someone came up to me and asked me if I had any pictures of foxes. Although I had a couple of pictures of foxes, they were not very good and basically only record shots. This chap told me he regularly had foxes coming into his garden, and if I wanted some good shots I should call round to see him. Initially I did not follow up the invitation, but after a few weeks I went around to see him. I was surprised to find that his garden was in fact 7 acres, and a large part of it was quite wild. When I realised the potential the location had, I asked if I could set up a canvas hide for a few weeks to try and get some fox pictures. The owner of the land was quite happy to do this, providing that I gave him some prints of the pictures that I took. I set up a small canvas hide near the wooded area and left it there for a couple of days so the fox could get used to it. The first evening that I sat in the hide I saw a fox, but it was not near enough to get a decent shot. To be honest, I was pleased just to see a fox, even though the evening was not photographically productive. Over the next couple of weeks the fox became used to the hide and started to come well within range for photography. I say fox, but there was in fact 3 families of foxes that visited the location. I regularly put out food scraps to entice the fox to come within range for photography. This worked so well that on one occasion I had 4 foxes in front of the hide. Which one do I photograph? While waiting for the fox to show, I noticed there were quite a few birds at the location, so I asked the owner of the land if I could set up a bird table, bird bath and some feeders. Ian, the chap who owned the land, was quite happy for me to do this. Over the next couple of months I spent a lot of time photographing the different birds while waiting for the fox to arrive. After a few months I asked the owner if I could carry on photographing at the location as a long-term project. He was quite happy for me to do this, so I asked him if it would be agreeable for me to build a proper wooden hide that would be big enough to take 2 tripods. Not only was he happy with me to do this, he also helped me build it. Although initially I had a bird bath for the small birds to bathe in, I felt I would get better pictures if I could make a shallow pond. Once again, Ian was quite okay with this. Basically, the pond was just a very shallow bird bath made to look like a pond. This was so that I could get natural looking shots of birds bathing and drinking. The pond only measured 3 foot by 3 foot and was very shallow. The depth was very important. I made it so that I had gently sloping edges, and it was only 2 inches deep in the middle. That way the small birds could get in at the edges and bathe quite happily, whilst the larger birds could bathe in the middle without getting out of their depth. One advantage of the pond being small and shallow was that it did not take huge amounts of water to fill it or keep it topped up. Over the years this pond enabled me to produce some very satisfying images. It was particularly productive in the summertime when an assortment of birds would come down to drink and bathe. The larger birds like jays and juvenile green woodpeckers particularly liked to come and use the pond and would often be there for more than 10 minutes. One of the problems that I did have was grey squirrels wrecking the feeders. Cage feeders will go some way to stopping them doing this. They allow the small birds to get to the seed, but it stops the squirrels and larger birds from dominating the setup. Initially I did not like cage feeders, but I soon realised that I could thread branches into them. This allowed the birds to land on these props before going into the feeder. This worked best when you had several birds coming in at once. Then birds will queue up on the twigs branch waiting for their turn. After a couple of years, I wanted to photograph birds at ground level. The existing hide that I had would not allow me to do this, so I asked Ian if it would be possible for me to build another hide for ground level shots. For low level shots, you need to be lying down on the ground, which can get very uncomfortable for long periods. To get around this problem, I dug a hole 4 foot square by 3 foot deep and built a half-sized hide around this. Getting in and out was a bit of an exercise, but once in the hide, I could shoot along the ground, and this produced some striking low-level images. One of my earlier YouTube videos was on photographing at ground level. In this video I go into more detail about how to photograph at ground level, and I put the link to that video in the description. Finding different ways to photograph the birds was part of the fun of using this location, and it was surprising how quickly the birds become used to the latest prop or setup. This setup was one that I constructed from an old wooden fence. There is a small channel at the back for birds seed and suet. It had spikes on the bottom so I could move it easily into any position that I wanted. When the birds landed on it to feed, it produced some very natural looking shots. Part of the fun of having a feeding station is setting things up and looking for props. Walking around a woodland looking for interesting props is fun in itself, but even more so when you can actually get a nice bird sitting on there like this jay. Once you set a feeding station up, it won't be long before you start to attract predators. We found that we were having regular visits from a sparrowhawk, and although it didn't catch many birds, now and again it would certainly like to come down and use the pond. Great spotted and green woodpeckers always look attractive on the side of a tree. I screwed this old log of silver birch onto a post and drilled holes into the side of the log. These I would fill with a mixture of crushed peanuts, birdcake and suet. The woodpeckers loved to come to this, and it produced some very pleasing images. About 10 years ago, I introduced a photographic friend of mine to share the location. Work was preventing me from visiting as often as I'd like, and she helped me to keep the feeders topped up and keep the site running. She also brought new ideas and setups into the equation so that we could get different images. All good things come to an end, and between us we decided that the location had run its course. There is not the range of birds and wildlife at the location as when I first went there over 20 years ago. As a final farewell, in June I did manage to get my best fox cub pictures in all the time I've spent there, and it was a nice farewell to the location. I made a YouTube video on how I photographed the fox cubs, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. Many thanks to Ian for allowing me to use his land for over 20 years. On a brighter note, I have a new location quite near to where I live, and it will be interesting to see what birds I can attract there. I will be making future videos on how I set this new location up and pictures that I obtained from the site. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Please check out my other YouTube videos, and thanks for watching.